Hello everyone, welcome back. In this module, we will be covering the first section of your Chapter 6 from the Mankiw textbook, the price control policies. So there's another section talking about the tax burdens, but we will put it aside for this course, and we'll focus on the price ceilings and price floor for now. So Chapter 6 are basically connected to previous chapters, and we talk about some real-world government policies and using the supply and demand model and some knowledge, right, of elasticity we just covered from last chapter. So make sure you spend some time to read the 6.1 of your textbook. Okay, so let's get started. I would like to start today's lecture from a hot and ongoing debate, that is the Boston's rent control proposal. So we don't know if that proposal is going to be passed or not, but we do know that in history and actually right now, right, many places had or is having certain type of rent stabilization or rent control policies. So Boston itself used to have a rent control from 1970 to 1994. And it was lifted in 1994, and now Mayor Wu is trying to bring that back to Boston. However, in Oregon, in California, and in New York City, right, they still have rent control policies. So I hope this this lecture will help you understand what is rent control and help you to understand Mayor Wu's proposal on bringing some rent stabilizations to Boston and hopefully can provide more affordable housing to Bostonians. So a well accepted, right, perception on price or rent control specifically is that it does limits the renters' mobility, which means give them more like security, especially in an uncertainty of the economics. And rent control, like based on studies, right, they lower the displacements of tenants. However, there are also studies that find there are, of course, people who lose in this game, right? Especially landlords. They will be discouraged in the rental housing market, right? And that also sometimes discourage like the development of new housing. So there are pros and there are cons, right, regarding a rent control policy. However, in textbook, we started from a kind of an old-fashioned model of price controls, which is actually different from the ongoing price controls or rent stabilization policies nowadays. And that means the real effect of today's like kind of up-to-date rental stabilization is hard to determine, is yet to be discovered. So when speaking of price controls, there are mainly two types of price controls. First is called a price ceiling, and the other one is called a price floor. So a price ceiling is a legal maximum of certain price, right? And it's called a ceiling because you cannot go above. It's like there is a ceiling constraint, right? It's like a cap in the market. And the price floor is a legal minimum on the price, which means you cannot go under the price floor. You cannot go under the legal minimum, right, enforced by law. So both price controls are designed to try to protect certain parties who is in a disadvantaged situation, right? So for example, we usually see price ceilings in the rental market, which means certain maximum rent is enforced in certain market, so that preventing landlords to increase their rent, like usually above certain amount. So that's the classic model, classic definition of price ceilings, right? And the price floor is usually used in labor market to prevent like the labor wage to go under certain minimum price. So in that way, the government can protect the benefits of workers. However, price controlling policies are not always not always effective, because there is a condition. We call it a binding condition. Only the price controls that are binding will be pushing the price away from its like the market equilibrium price. So in that sense, the government is actually imposing, right, certain influence into the market. Otherwise, if the price control policy is not binding, then actually the policy has no effect. The market will end up in the market equilibrium situations anyways. So now let's use our old friend, the supply and demand figure graph analysis, to help us understand what does a binding price ceilings mean and what does a not binding price ceilings means. Okay, so on this graph, on the left-hand side of this slide, I drew a market. So I didn't specify what market. In general, let's just assume it's a certain market, right? It has a price, has a quantity, we have supply curve, we have demand curve, and this red horizontal line represents a price ceiling that is imposed into the market. So this graph shows you a binding case. And this graph on the right-hand side is a not binding case. So you might ask, what binding is a math term in this case? So it's like when you're facing a inequality constraint, such as price can go less than or equal to, say, $10, right? That's actually an example of a price ceiling, right? Because price ceiling is when you cannot go above a certain amount. So in this case, if your price ceiling is set to be $10, then mathematically talking, your achievable, feasible price level will be P is less than or equal to $10. So in this case, when the equal sign holds, right, when P equals $10, we call it the binding case. So on the left-hand side, consider this P ceiling to be $10, right, as we assumed. In this case, the market price can never achieve its market equilibrium because the law enforced at $10 and only prices that is below or equal to $10 are achievable. So you can only price this good in here, but never in here. So in this case, we call it binding, and we say the price ceiling is in effect, right? Which means the government is intervening the market. And when the price ceiling is binding, the market equilibrium, instead of being the intersection of supply and demand curve, is actually the intersection of the price ceiling and the supply curve. So it's right here. That is because at this price level, there are only this little amount of goods being provided to the market. So let's call this, right, at the price level of $10 or P ceiling, the amount that suppliers put or provided in the market is QS. And at this price level, the quantity, the amount of certain goods that is desired by the consumers is QD. And the market can only be in equilibrium at this point because that's exactly how much, right, is being traded in the market. So in that sense, there is a shortage, or we say there's an excess demand, right? Because at this price level, consumers do want more, but not everyone will be satisfied. So you see there is a downside, obviously, of a price ceiling, of a binding price ceiling. So let's see what happens when a price ceiling policy is actually not binding. Say if we set a price ceiling that is really high, that is even above the market equilibrium, then what happens? Recall that price ceiling means a certain price level that you cannot go above. So anything underneath the price ceiling is achievable, right? So if that's the case, if the price ceiling policy is not binding, the market will simply end up in the market equilibrium level right here. So in that case, a not binding price ceiling will give you a free market result at the end. So if, say, the policymakers' goal is to, say, help out, right, the low-income group, in that sense, this policy is not in play at all. So it's a failure of the policy, which is not desired either, right? Because there are costs for implementing a new law or like help to implement certain policies. So we do want it to have an impact, right? But the policymakers, they can never predict exactly what's going to happen or what is going on in the market. So it does happen, right? That our price ceiling is actually not binding. Apply. So now let's consider if we could draw a demand and supply graph for the Boston rental housing market and try to analyze what are the possible scenarios, right, after the rental control is in place. So first we consider maybe a not binding scenario. So on this graph, I draw a pretty inelastic demand and inelastic supply, which makes sense, which is likely to hold, right, in big cities like Boston, because we know the available land for rental housing is likely to be inelastic, which means usually it wouldn't vary too much with the price. And our textbook actually assumes an inelastic, right, supply of rental houses. So in here, I drew a super vertical supply curve. And also in big cities like Boston or New York City, the demand for rental housing is likely to be inelastic as well. It's like we're imposing a price ceiling or rental control, rental ceiling, whatever you call it, which means, right, there is a certain law that's restricting the rent for housing to go no further than a certain price, right? It's like a ceiling, so we cannot go above that price. So up to today, March 20th, 2023, Mayor Wu's proposal on the rent control in Boston is actually similar to what California and Oregon is carrying out right now. It's like tying the increase of rent charged by landlords to the annual inflation rate, right? So no matter what the inflation rate is, the landlord can increase it no more than 10%. And if the inflation rate is really low, then the landlord cannot charge cannot increase their rent by 6% plus the inflation rate. Say if we are seeing a 2% increase of CPI, then the rent cap for according to that policy, right, would be 2% plus 6%. So that means landlords cannot raise more than 8% in 12 months of their rent. All right, now let's consider if that's the case, that is the real policy, is there a chance that the price ceiling is actually above the market equilibrium price? I think it could, right? And if that's the case, this price ceiling or rental control, right, rental ceiling, rental cap is not binding at all, which means it has no effect into the housing market, holding everything else constant. But of course, we cannot, in real life, we cannot see, we cannot hold, right? Everything else can unchanged. There are many things that is ongoing that we need to take into account, right? People's expectations could change. And the policy, how the policy end up with, we don't know. Like whether there will be exemptions, right? We don't know about that. But based on the theories of housing market, some predictions will be commonly accepted, right? After a price ceiling is in place. So first, price ceiling usually discourages, right, landlords. So there could be a decrease in the supply of rental houses. And if that happens, we might move from a market equilibrium that is not binding, right? Like here, I use this white dot to denote market equilibriums. It could move from here to a new equilibrium that is actually binding now. If you consider a free market, right, and if the supply of, say, rental homes, rental places decreases, then you would see a new market equilibrium right here. But because of the imposed price ceiling or rental ceilings, the market will end up right here. So just like what we talked from last slide, there will be a shortage, right? Because in this case, how much is being traded in the market is determined by the intersection of your price ceiling and the supply, the market supply, the new supply in the market, right? So it's right here. And even though we have some excess demand, it cannot be satisfied in the market. So we have a shortage of housing. So if that's the case, then we will be concerned, right? And what else could bring our rental control to an undesired outcome? That is, some people believe, right, when the rental control is in place in Boston, that would further increase the already high growing demand for rental houses in Boston. So if we interpret in using a demand supply analysis, demand supply model, we interpret, right, that as a rightward movement of our demand curve. So instead of this D here, right, we now are at the new demand curve, the D prime. And if that happens, right, we used to be in a market equilibrium, exactly as a free market, but now we're not anymore. Because if we were in a free market, we would end up here after the demand for rental house grow, right? But because of the price ceiling, we can only end up here at this level. And again, we have some excess demand. We have a shortage in the rental housing market. So now let's think about Boston residents are seeing a high rental prices or a high increase, like high or a fast increase, right, in their rents. What is actually driving that? That's mostly likely a demand side pressure that is pushing the price up. So whether there is price ceiling or not, we would in the long run see this demand curve moving rightward all the time because Boston has its own features to attract more workers into the city, because basically for every growing city, right, the demand for housing will keep increasing. So even though we anticipate maybe the price or rental control will be not binding at the beginning, at some point, as long as the demand for housing grow fast enough, at some point it will create some shortage, or we say it will further, right, deepen the shortage in housing in Boston. So that's why many people, especially economists, they believe rental control is not the best resort to deal with the Boston rental or housing shortage. So now let's consider what are the alternatives to rental control. And if we think about, right, after thinking about the alternatives, maybe we can see why policymakers are still pursuing the rental control, even though they know it's not that effective, it causes problems, right? It might hurt the renters, tenants in the long run or in the future, why we had to propose that. So many people had brought up we should give low-income parties some rental subsidies, and which will help the low incomes to pay for their rent and stay in their facilities. And in that case, the landlords will be happy because they can still make the money, their desired amount of income. But what's the problem with it? That is, we all know that our economy is already in a high inflation, and rental subsidies basically just inject, right, money into the market, and that could, right, further deteriorate the inflation. So many people argue that, okay, so if we don't want to inject more money into the economy, how about we give low-income renters some tax credits? So first of all, many places, including Boston, already have certain tax credits policies, and the government might not be a big fan of it because they do live on their tax. What about maybe set certain taxes for super high rent? In that way, hopefully we can prevent landlords from setting their rent too high. So that is not a great policy either, because obviously levying taxes on landlords will further decrease the supply of rental houses, and that would push the price, the rents higher, right? So we do not want that either. So many economists have been emphasizing the final solution, the real resort solution to the shortage of housing in any places, is that we increase the supply by building public affordable housing or increasing the density, right, in the city so that we can accommodate more population. There are many, many ways, but the downside about that is it usually takes a long time for those type of housing policies to be in place and for voters to actually see it happens. So politicians, they will be intrinsically not prefer those type of policies, right? And also for, say, developers, for landlords, if there's, say, like more supplies in the market, that would push their rents down, right? Because if there's more supply, if there's more public housing going into the market, then the supply curve moves to the right, and that would push the market equilibrium price down. So there is pressure from those parties, developers and landlords as well, that preventing more housing supplies to be provided in the housing markets. So from the legislator's perspective, certain rent control can give them some instant, direct, right, policy effect, right? The voters can see, and that would bring up the debate, so they can draw the public attentions in that way. So they do have reasons to go for rental control. But again, there are many, many factors we are not taking into account, right? There are pros and cons of each policy. And hopefully with a combination of those policies, we can at least alleviate the shortage in housing in Boston. So far we've been talking about the price ceilings, and we use rent control as an example to illustrate what is a price ceiling, right? And next, we're going to move on to talk about an example of a price flooring. So the most common example of price floor is minimum wage policies, right? So when we're talking about wage, it's the price of your labor. So we're talking about a labor market. And if there is no government interventions, we'll end up with a free market, right, in this case. So this is a free labor market. Now let's consider what happens when there is a minimum wage policy in place. So again, minimum wage is an example of price floor. That means the government impose a policy that ensure the employers, they have to pay their employees the price that is no less than the minimum wage, right? So any prices above this price flooring will be feasible in that case. And if that's the case, this graph shows us a not binding case, because in this case, the market will have its own mechanism to try to achieve the market equilibrium, right? And is it feasible in this case? Yes, because any price level above the minimum wage is achievable. So in this case, the market is not binding. The market will end up with exactly the same outcome as a free market. Okay, now let's consider what happens when the minimum wage policy is binding. So that would be a minimum wage that is set to be above the free market equilibrium price or equilibrium wage, which means if there is no intervention, the market will end up here, right? But the government is trying to protect our workers. So they set a minimum wage to be above. Now what happens? So as the supplier of labors, we workers, when we see a price that is higher than the equilibrium market price or equilibrium market wage, we would like to provide more of our time, right? We would like to extend our working hours. But for the demanders of labors, the firms, the employers, when they see the market, when they see a wage that is higher than the market wage, they would actually demand less of labors. So on this graph, the new market equilibrium is actually this point. It's the intersection of a demand curve for laborers and the price floor, the minimum wage. So in this case, the amount of laborers being traded in market is actually this, is going to be less than the free market quantity, right? So which creates a labor surplus, which means there's excess supply of laborers and there is less demand for laborers than the free market case. So consider what is a labor surplus. That is, right, there's more workers than jobs. That's unemployment. That's definitely not what we want to see in an economy. So in this case, a price floor that is designed to try to help the workers might actually give an undesired outcome. That is, excess laborers, or there is unemployment in the labor market. So that brings us to the principle 6 and principle 7 that we talk about at the beginning of this course, right? That markets are usually a good way to organize economic activities, and government can sometimes improve market outcomes, but sometimes they might mess up, right? Their policies might lead to undesired market outcomes. So examples that we learn in this module would be price controls, right? Minimum wage might lead to unemployment, and price controls might lead to some shortage in a market.